Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this second session of our conference. I'm Chalmers. I'm the Deputy Director General here at RUSI, so it's really good to see quite a number of familiar faces here from the UK policy community and indeed from many people involved in these issues internationally. This session is going to be looking at the implications of the recently released United States Missile Defense Review, and the title is Consistency or Change. I guess it could be internally consistent and still be changing, or it could be external. Well, let's not go there. You could all our three panelists are very well qualified for answering that question and making any observations they have as to whether this is a significant change in US posture, and indeed, if it is, what that means for all of us in a very fast-moving debate about the role of missile defense. So I'm going to, unfortunately, Bradford Clark is unable to join us yet for the conference because of some mishap in relation to his flight from California. I'm not quite sure which continent he's on right now, but he's not here. So he does send us apologies. I think he's hoping to join us later in the conference, and that would be great if he could. So our first speaker is Frank Rose, who will be known to many of you. He's now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, but previously had a senior position in the US administration dealing with precisely these issues. So one of the United States leading experts on issues missile defense and nuclear related. Frank, over to you.
Well, Malcolm, thanks so much for the kind introduction. It's great to be back at RUSI. I'm delighted to share the podium this morning with Ken and Tom. And in my presentation today, I'd like to do three things. First, discuss what I think the Missile Defense Review, or the MDR, gets right. Second, identify some questions that I have about the MDR. And third, address some of the concerns that I have with regards to the MDR. Honestly, I think there's a lot that the 2019 MDR gets right. Let's start with U.S. Homeland Defense. Similar to the 2010 Ballistic Missile Defense Review, the MDR rightly makes defending the homeland of the United States the #1 priority for U.S. missile defense programs. To accomplish this, the review directs the Department of Defense to take a number of actions, including deploying 20 additional long-range missile defense interceptors at Fort Greely in Alaska, improving the kill vehicle on the long-range interceptor, deploying additional discrimination radars in Alaska, Hawaii, and other locations, upgrading existing radars, and examining the feasibility of the SM-3 Block 2A interceptor to engage certain ICBM-class threats. These improvements, in my view, to the Homeland Missile Defense System, which build on the Obama administration's efforts, should be sufficient to address the long-range missile threat to the United States in the near to midterm from rogue states like North Korea and potentially Iran. Now, the MDR did not recommend moving forward with the deployment of a third long-range interceptor site in the United States to improve the defense against potential ICBM-class threats from the Middle East. Iran currently does not have this capability, and if it were to develop such a capability, the long-range interceptors deployed in Alaska have the capability to defend the entire United States against potential ICBM-class missiles from the Middle East. Given that capability and the large cost associated with building a new interceptor site in the eastern United States, I believe this was the correct decision. The MDR also wisely states that the United States will, quote, continue to rely on nuclear deterrence to address the large and more sophisticated Russian and Chinese ballistic missile capabilities. This is consistent with the policy of the 3 previous U.S. administrations. Additionally, the MDR places a high priority on deploying effective regional missile defense capabilities. Among other things, the MDR directs DoD to assess the need for additional terminal high altitude area defense systems, or THAAD, continue the deployment of the Aegis Ashore site in Poland, and increase the number of Aegis ballistic missile defense capable warships from 38 to 60 by the end of fiscal 2023. In addition to enhancing U.S. regional missile defense capabilities, the MDR directs DoD to expand missile defense cooperation with allies and partners. Indeed, I think the review includes some of the best language on international cooperation to appear in any U.S. missile defense policy document. Now, let me pivot to areas of the Missile Defense Review where I have some concerns, or let me say questions for this part. Acknowledging the evolution of the missile threat, the MDR directs the Department of Defense to, quote, explore the development of several new types of technologies. The first of these concepts are boost phase systems designed to intercept ballistic missiles in their boost phase before reentry vehicle separates from the booster. According to the review, these types of systems, quote, increase the likelihood of successfully countering missile threats and, quote, provide a cost-effective capability to destroy boosting missiles in the early phases of their flight, end quote. The MDR recommends exploring 2 boost phase intercept options: an F-35 Lightning fighter plane armed with a kinetic interceptor and a compact high-energy laser on an unmanned drone. Given the advances in the threat, I believe that the United States should pursue research and development on new missile defense concepts like boost phase intercept. That said, the operational and technical challenges associated with boost phase defense should not be underestimated, as was highlighted by the American Physical Society in a 2003 report in the National Academy of Sciences in a 2011 report. And we should also be mindful that 2 previous boost phase defense systems, the airborne laser and the kinetic energy interceptor, were ultimately canceled for a variety of operational, technical, and cost reasons. The MDR also notes the important role of space-based systems in missile defense. It argues that space-based sensors can provide, quote, birth-to-death tracking of missiles that would greatly improve terrestrial-based interceptors' ability to engage missile threats. I fully agree with this statement, and given the potential benefits of space-based sensors, the United States should begin research and develop on a space-based sensor layer. However, similar to boost phase defense systems, this would not be the first time that the United States has sought to develop a space-based missile tracking system. 2 previous attempts, the Space-Based Infrared Systems Low, or SBIRS Low, and the Precision Tracking and Surveillance System, PTSS, were ultimately canceled due to a variety of cost and technical issues. That said, 2 SBIRS Low satellites were built and eventually launched as technology demonstrators known as the Space Tracking and Surveillance System, or STS, demonstration satellites. According to the Missile Defense Agency, those 2 satellites have provided very useful information. Now, let me focus on where I have some concerns about the Missile Defense Review. Well, the MDR takes a very cautious approach towards the role of missile defense in Russia and China's strategic deterrence. It takes a somewhat different view on the role of missile defenses in addressing the threat from their regional missile capabilities. In particular, it recommends that the United States develop capabilities to defeat Russian and Chinese regional ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and hypersonic glide vehicles. To be fair, this change is not as big of a policy departure from the previous administration as first appears. Indeed, with regards to China, the Obama administration's 2010 BMDR stated, and I quote, "It is important that China understand that the United States will work to ensure the protection of our forces, allies, and partners in East Asia against all regional missile threats." There is no doubt that Russia and China are deploying a full spectrum of regional missile capabilities designed to target U.S. deployed forces and allies. However, there are also legitimate questions as to whether active missile defenses are the most effective way to address that threat, or whether it would be more effective to invest in other capabilities, like a conventional variant of the long-range standoff nuclear cruise missile that would allow the United States to hold at risk key Russian and Chinese targets. Determining how to effectively counter the Russian and Chinese regional threat is a serious issue that requires much more study. In addition to space-based sensors, the MDR argues that space basing of interceptors also may provide significant advantages, particularly for boost phase defense. Now, the MDR does not recommend at this point that the United States move forward with space-based interceptors. What they call for is a 6-month study to look at the issue in greater detail. However, based on statements that I've seen from a number of senior officials in the Trump administration, it seems that they are inclined to move down this road, but we will see. But the point I would note, and Jim Miller, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and I wrote an article a couple months ago about this. If the United States does move forward with space-based interceptors, Russia and China would almost certainly react, as they see our space-based missile defense potential as an existential threat to their strategic deterrent. And finally, the MDR is silent on the resources that will be needed to implement the strategy and programs outlined in the review. Now, we should have a better idea of the resources necessary in the next couple of weeks when the administration releases its fiscal year 2020 budget. But we also have to put missile defense in a larger context. First, the United States is in the process of doing a major modernization of its strategic nuclear forces. At the same time, a recapitalization of its conventional forces. And on top of that, we have a $1 trillion deficit. So one of the things that we're going to need to figure out is what is affordable in the context of the current budget requirements and our other military modernization requirements. So let me conclude by saying, overall, I believe the 2019 MDR is a mixed bag. On the positive side, its recommendations to enhance the near to midterm effectiveness of U.S. Homeland Defense are good. So is the language on regional missile defense in cooperation with our allies and partners. And its recommendation to examine new boost phase defense options and space-based sensor capabilities have merit. However, those technologies are certain to face technical, operational, and cost-related challenges. I would say my biggest concern about the MDR is where it takes us on space-based interceptor capabilities. If the United States moves forward in this direction, I fear that Russia and China are certain to react. Finally, as I just mentioned as well, there are serious questions about how the administration will pay for the missile defense program outlined in the MDR, especially when the United States has big bills pending for strategic nuclear modernization and the recapitalization of our conventional forces. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Frank, thank you so much for that presentation. I think you put so many of the issues in relation to the Missile Defense Review on the table and emphasized those areas with which you agreed, but also those issues, particularly in relation to the impact of wider strategic stability in relations with Russia and China as one of the key issues of concern, which I'm sure our two other speakers will return to and we can have a really good debate about. The next speaker is Ken Todorov, who had a long and distinguished career in the US Air Force, ending up with the rank of Brigadier General and served as Deputy Director for the MDA. He now is Vice President of Missile Defense Solutions at Northrop Grumman. Ken, please.
Thanks, Malcolm. I'm going to break with tradition. I like to break with tradition. If you know me a little bit, I'm going to have you participate here for a moment in a question. And everyone has to participate, even if you don't have in your mind a particularly informed answer, but it's about the MDR, and acknowledge that some of us in the room are maybe more sort of learned in the MDR, but that's what this panel is about. So I want you to think a little bit about the review that we're talking about here. And the panel poses a question: more consistency or more change, implying from the previous policies. So I want you to raise your hand. Everyone has to raise their hand one way or another. No one can abstain. Even if you don't think you know a whole lot about the MDR, I'm sure you know enough to say, is it more consistency with the policy in the past, or is it more different? That is the... Oh, now we're going to get technical on me. Let's just say from the last policy, published policy, the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. Use that as your yardstick, because that's an excellent point, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment. So show of hands of you, who thinks the MDR is more consistency over previous policies? So everyone has to raise their hand one way or another. Scientifically, okay, got a good yardstick. Who thinks it's more change? All right, I think everyone raised their hand. A couple people were like, in and out. It looked to me about 50-50. I don't know, maybe a little more in the. Do
you want to recount?
To recount?
No.
48-52, says the learned gentleman. Here's how I will vote. More consistency or change? Yes. That's the cheap way out. I acknowledge that's a cheap way out, but I'll make my case here in a moment, and hopefully it'll resonate with you. Malcolm, again, thanks for the introduction, and I'd like to thank Peter Sidharth for the opportunity to speak today. To my fellow panelists, Frank and Tom, who I have a great deal of respect for, thank you for allowing me to join you. As said, I'm Ken Todorov. I'm the Vice President for Missile Defense Solutions at Northrop Grumman. Previously, I did work in government. My last job as the Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Agency. A couple years ago, previous to that, I was the director of something called JIAMDO, the Joint Integrated Air and Missile Defense Organization, which is a mouthful. My colleague, Admiral Arch Macy, was also a former director there. You'll hear from him later. Very proud to have that role in JIAMDO. And then previous to that, I was at United States Northern Command, and NORAD, where my job really focused on the air and missile defense of the U.S. homeland and of Canada as well. So I come to you today with that as my background, really less of a industry guy and more sort of from my previous background, but very, very interested in this topic, and I'm happy to share my views with it. So I raised my hand twice, more consistency and more change. It really depends on your perspective. If you take a look at the yardstick as the past policy, I would say clearly there's quite a bit of change in there, and I'll highlight some of those areas, some of which Frank already did a very nice job highlighting for you. If you take a look at where missile defense policy has gone over the last 3, 4, 5 years, and some seminal documents that have already been published by the U.S. Department, I would say, frankly, it's a lot more consistency. And here's what I mean by that. If you take a look at a joint publication that was published in 2017, Countering Air and Missile Threats by the U.S. Joint Staff, and then another document that I'm actually particularly proud of, it's this one here. I commend it to all of you if you've not seen it. It's only 7 pages long. It's on the internet. It's published in 2013, so you may say, it's a little dated. But I actually think it's actually pretty good in terms of where the direction that missile defense and integrated air and missile defense ought to be going. And I think the MDR took a lot of its clues, frankly, from this document, which is the Joint Integrated Air and Missile Defense Vision for 2020, published by then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Marty Dempsey, in 2013. Also had a big hand was Admiral Sandy Winnefeld. At the time was the vice chairman of the Joint Staff. And I'll get back to that document in a moment, but if you take this document, again, it's available on the internet, and you take the 2017 Countering Air and Missile Threats document, I would say that there's less change in the MDR than maybe at first meets glance. My point is, I think that U.S., in terms of policy and strategy toward missile defense and integrated air and missile defense, has been developing since the last BMDR. So depending on your yardstick, if you use the last BMDR, yes, more change. If you take these documents and what the department in the U.S. has been doing, I would say more consistency. I want to be sure to call out in a good way, a shout out to the people that were behind the MDR. I know many of them. As you know, the story behind when the document was released, and all of us were waiting with bated breath that this thing would be out, and we were told it was going to be out early in the administration. It took some time to release. Politics got in the way of that. Some individuals inside the department sort of wanted to put their fingerprints on it. The White House got involved as well. And so it took a while for the document to come out. And that's no criticism toward the people, the really smart people that put it together. And they should be commended for their work. So any criticism I offer today of the MDR is not reflected toward them. As these things go in large bureaucracies, they do get watered down, things get taken out, things get lined out for various reasons. And it's tough to put out a document that's really succinct in a very clear way. Let's go back to the things that I think that the MDR gets right. And many of these, I'm going to repeat some of the things that Frank so articulately said. Number one, it calls out missile defense as a stabilizing factor. And I think those of us who have been around the air and missile defense debate for a while, those of us who are pro, anyway, would say that that is very much true. I think kudos to the authors for calling that out, and I think our adversaries should take note when they try to claim that missile defense is destabilizing. I personally think it's just the opposite, part of the equation that provides stability and deterrence for our nations. Number two, I think kudos for calling out space. And to my friend Alexandra Stickings, I'm not going to call space a domain. She says thank you. But the fact that the MDR does call it out specifically in the ways that Frank articulated, I won't repeat those, I think is a very positive step and a very positive force for the future. But I would say that the MDR falls short in terms of its discussion, or at least of its policy implications for integrated air and missile defense. Yes, the B is gone from the document. That's great. I think we all thought that needed to happen. And there is some mention of IAMD, Integrated Air and Missile Defense. But again, I don't think that the document goes far enough in sort of codifying how the United States, and certainly our partners and allies around the world, should approach that. So let's look at the review and dive in a little more specifically on some of the pros, the pluses and minuses, again, from my view. Once again, articulating missile defense as stabilizing is a very good thing. Talking about space, a very good thing. And it talks about it in terms of both sensing and the possibility for space-based interceptors. I won't have any comments on whether or not the merits of both of those, but I will say space as a sensing layer is absolutely necessary to the future of missile defense, particularly countering the advanced threats. And as Frank mentioned, I think calling out the contributions and the inclusion of our United States allies and partners in sort of a comprehensive defense is absolutely appropriate and a very good thing for the review. So kudos on that side. On the other side of the equation, where I might be a little more critical, and again, it's easy for me to criticize, I wasn't involved in the writing of it, so we're all Monday morning quarterbacks, to use an American analogy. But I think it leaves a number of the tough decisions sort of at play. Frank mentioned resources. There was a question earlier about dollars. The Missile Defense Review largely seems to imply we're going to continue to do more of the same, and we're going to continue to do a bunch of new stuff too. And all that is very, very expensive. So I would say it leaves for debate, and it leaves for a lot of consideration what path we go down. The tough decisions were not necessarily implied in the MDR. Could have gone further there. I'm fond of saying more, buying more stuff is not necessarily more when it's more of the same stuff. The threat has changed. Rick did a very nice job sort of talking about that in the first presentation and how that's evolving and changing. And so is it really the right course of action to continue to buy more of the same stuff, maybe some of that stuff? But we really have to have an eye toward what's different, what different resource and investment and technological things do we need to dedicate ourselves to solve the tough problems in the future. Again, there's not enough IAMD focus for me. I'll leave it at that. There are a number of broad do-outs. If you read the MDR, there's 16 or so sort of the department shall study or this agency shall look at. And those things are great, and that's to further the conversation. But again, it sort of leaves them out there, and I'll call study land. And oftentimes, those are left for interpretation. And when the studies come back, what direction do we go in? That's a question that I think the MDR perhaps leaves unanswered. I talked about more of the same, not necessarily being more. One of the big things that I think I would love to have seen more of is this notion about the offense-defense mix and that part of the equation. This is a missile defense conference. Someone suggested this maybe should be called the Missile Deterrence Conference. I would say in the future, the next time the review is written, let's call it the Missile Defeat Review, because I really think you have to have an eye toward the offensive part of this equation to really fully appreciate and consider the elements of missile and integrated air and missile defense. What I mean by defeat and the offense-defense mix is what are those ways we can get at our adversaries before they even launch, the famous left of launch sort of phrase that's been popularly used. Do we really consider that in terms of its implications for missile defense policy? How do the two marry and play against each other? That offense-defense mix component is extremely important, and while there's a mention of it, I'm not sure it goes far enough. What I suggest is some kind of a comprehensive missile defeat, denying our adversaries the ability to even launch, so we don't have to deal with a missile defense or an integrated air and missile defense problem. Have we fully considered and vetted those aspects? So one of the things, again, what the MDR I think does well, and Rick mentioned this and had some great material on it, was the nod toward the advanced threat, the hypersonic threat. That's something that clearly I think is necessary for us to look at. But again, the review doesn't really go further than saying we got to deal with it. Maybe not appropriate for a review of this nature, but dealing with it will take an end-to-end approach. Again, I'm agreeing with Rick here, an architecture-first approach, focusing on a space layer, because as Admiral John Hill says, if you can't see it, you can't hit it, focusing on kinetic interceptors, a non-kinetic part of the equation, and command and control as well. How do you tie it all together into an architecture-first approach? So I'll conclude by saying the Missile Defense Review, more consistency than change, yes. I would say more consistency than change. I think it's more consistent with our previous policies, particularly if you take into account those documents that have been published in recent past. But I don't think the review went far enough, and hopefully highlighted a couple of those areas to spark your interest and thoughts. Again, I think the next review, if I had my way, would be called the Missile Defeat Review, and perhaps there are people in this room that will have an opportunity to write that. I encourage them to think about that and the implications for the offense-defense mix. Delighted to be here at the conference. Look forward to the conversations in the next day and a half or so, and thanks for your attention.
Ken, thanks so much for that. Put a whole bunch of extra issues on the table. I particularly like your missile defeat conference idea. So maybe when we get feedback at the end of our event, people would like to comment on whether we should change the title of next year's conference in that regard. It's certainly a good catchy title for us to get our teeth into in the Q&A. Our third and final speaker is Tom Karako, who leads the Missile Defense Project at CSIS, and I'm sure many, if not most of you, will have read his work on these issues. I look forward to your remarks, Tom.
Well, thank you, Malcolm, Peter, the whole RUSI team. It's an honor to be here. This is an important annual event, and it's a privilege to be here with so many folks that are shaping this conversation. Earlier, Peter invoked Bob Dylan. Times are changing, so I'm going to do the same. I think he also has a song called Hard Rains Are Gonna Fall. So my take here is going to be a little bit different from what my friends have said thus far. So the 2019 Missile Defense Review is an attempt to adapt U.S. missile defense policy, posture, and programs to the new reality of great power competition, consistent or pursuant to the national defense strategy's overall pivot away from counterterrorism and rogue states. The task of the MDR was in this respect greater than the task for the nuclear posture review. U.S. nuclear forces have always been tailored to major powers like Russia and China. And so, despite a lot of new language about how the environment has changed, the 2018 nuclear posture review at the end of the day recommended only 2 modest supplements to the Obama nuclear modernization program. By contrast, we have for a quarter century tried to push apart our active missile defenses from Russia and China. Now, I can recite, as well as anyone, the caveats to that in the 2010 BMDR, as well as some programs that serve as the exception to that rule. But I think it's fair to say, overall, that is the broad rule in terms of focus on rogue states in Bush and Obama administrations. In this review's preface, Acting Defense Secretary Shanahan urges that, quote, the scale and urgency of change required to renew our conventional missile defense overmatch must not be underestimated. Put differently, adapting to countering missile threats from major powers is going to require much more than a couple modest supplements. I say this reluctantly and with a lot of respect for the drafters, as Ken said, but my contention today is as follows: that the modest changes endorsed by the 2019 MDR underestimate the scale and urgency of change required, that its current recommendations are insufficiently aligned, therefore, with the National Defense Strategy, and that further adaptation will be required to achieve what it calls the comprehensive approach that should guide the next decade of missile defense efforts. So why do I say this? Well, the first question any policy document should answer is what problem you're trying to solve. So let's talk about the threat. In the report rollout, Shanahan noted that we face a missile-rich environment. Missile threats, he said, are, quote, growing disproportionately to other capabilities. Writ large, the world is not developing new fighter and bomber aircraft, they are developing missiles, end quote. Indeed, we are witnessing a kind of a new period, one characterized by increased global supply and demand for a wide spectrum of missile threats, air and missile threats. See Rick's chart from the last panel, across all aspects of altitude, propulsion type, range, and mission. And it's not merely the diversity or sophistication of any one category that really characterizes the challenge. Rather, it is their wicked combination with operational concepts that mix and match them with lethal effect. Just look at how Russia has been fighting in Ukraine and Syria. Even the Houthis brag about using UAVs to target Patriot radars in the Yemen missile war. So, the central problem that this review needed to address, I'll suggest, is that of complex and integrated air and missile attack from major powers. Yes, North America is a region, and yes, Homeland Defense rightfully remains the highest priority, but the problem set needing the most change and the most attention is not the defense of the U.S. homeland from rogue state ballistic missiles, but rather the defense against this complex and integrated attack on our forward forces. From President Trump on down, administration officials have referred to a new era of missile defense. The contours of what that era needs to be have been articulated, as Ken notes, on multiple prior occasions, including the doctrinal promulgation of IAMD in Joint Publication 3-01 in April 2017. So, despite its title, the 2019 MDR substantively remains, frankly, a bit more of the B MDR ordered by President Trump in 2017, and less of the IAMD review that we needed, which is to say the report required by Congress in its FY 2017 NDAA, which, by the way, was called the Missile Defeat Review. So part of my friendly criticism of the MDRs is due to this apparent neglect of several elements of those statutory requirements. So to elaborate this, I want to first address a bit of an inadequacy of the public debate thus far, and then address 5 concrete themes: integration, air defense, mobility, survivability, and space. So first, just a bit on how I think the public debate has been a bit muddled. On the one hand, we have those that are disappointed that there isn't the Brilliant Pebbles 2.0, and are disappointed that it did not radically change the deterrence and defense calculus with Russian and Chinese ICBMs. But Russia and China were put on notice 30 years ago about Brilliant Pebbles, and they've had 3 decades to adapt. And largely their adaptations have been accomplished by going lower, with greater emphasis on endo-atmospheric delivery. Witness short burn, depressed trajectory ICBMs, more maneuverability, and the advent of hypersonic glide vehicles, not to mention counter-space attack, advanced cruise missiles, and UAVs. Mike Griffin's public comments that space-based interceptors are probably not the way to go for HGVs have been largely ignored by this camp. On the other side, there are those who see MDR's extended essay about the notional utility of space-based interceptors and allege that it's really the harbinger of radical change. This, I think, is a bit of tilting at windmills. The MDR explicitly disavows going after Russian and Chinese ICBMs because of their number and sophistication. And yet, in the absence of concrete programmatic implementation, all the language about the desirability of such things is a bit like raising the Jolly Roger while staying in port. All the costs and none of the benefits. This is not SDI 2.0. As Condi Rice once said, this is not the son of Star Wars. This is not even the grandson of Star Wars. So these 2 camps variously criticize the MDR for not doing enough or for acting like it's doing too much about Russian and Chinese strategic threats. I think I don't stand with either camp, and I think it's frankly at odds with what the document says and does, and what forthcoming budget submissions are likely to do. From my perspective, this misses the point. It's a red herring. The fundamental shortcoming of the MDR is a bit closer to what Ken articulated, that what it says and does is too little to accomplish what it and the National Defense Strategy require as its focus, namely regional missile threats from major powers. And this, I believe, is why it's insufficiently aligned with the NDS. So let me walk through these 5 themes. First, integration. A version of the word integration appears 77 times in the document. It's one of the Pentagon's favorite buzzwords, taken to mean all manner of things. Integration is the new black. But the Latin root of the word integration literally just means to bring things together into a whole. And so when you talk about integration, it depends on what it is you're bringing together and what kind of a whole you're combining them to. Most of the MDR's integration references are about synchronizing active defenses with attack operations. Good. Secondary usage is the integration of active and passive defenses. Good. A third is sort of a more generic relation to diplomacy. They actually don't say much about what I would call true integration, which is to say integrated fire control. But the one sense of integration, the one part of integrated air and missile defense that is most absent here is also, I think, the most urgent. And that is the integration of active missile defense with active air defense. So let me deal with that. It's really the second point. Despite some lip service to IAMD, this is the capability that is most lacking. Shanahan's preface talks about how military superiority has been taken for granted, but that is especially true for air superiority. American power projection is not uniquely challenged just by ballistic missiles anymore, but from that problem of complex and integrated air and missile attack. And I'm sorry, but it's no excuse to say that it's up to the combatant commanders to provide air defense for BMDS elements. Such commanders cannot use pixie dust to defend the big, energy-emanating, self-designating targets called radars. These are what General Hyten calls big, fat, juicy targets. They are critical nodes in the kill chain. If they are taken out, the BMDS will be suppressed. It was incumbent on this policy document to lay out the need to protect the BMDS from asymmetric air attack, so as to drive the requirements for the capabilities that could then be given to those commanders. The only cruise missile defense plan described in the document is a pre-existing three-phase NORAD effort for the U.S. homeland. And if you think I'm exaggerating on this point, consider the following. Most of the report is a description of the program of record, of what's been going on for recent years. But the lack of focus on air defense is so pervasive that it doesn't even acknowledge current efforts for countering UAVs, the IBCS program, the foundation of the Army's IAMD construct, the Army's M-SHORAD initiative, which is pretty much directed at Russia, or comparable directed energy efforts in the Navy. Frustration with cruise missile defense delays has led Congress to require the U.S. to buy Iron Dome for a kind of interim capability. And that's fine, but suffice to say, the kinds of threats we'll face from major powers are probably going to be a bit more sophisticated than what is currently faced by Israel. And those lower-tier air defense efforts are exactly what needs to be most encouraged. MDR has a total of 12 follow-on studies. It seems to me there was room for at least one more on the integration of air defense and missile defense and force protection of BMDS elements. Let me talk a little bit now about mobility. This is another kind of long theme in the report as a desirable characteristic. It almost seems torn from the 2001 NPR with some updated nods to the NDS theme of dynamic force employment. But here's the problem. The discussion of mobility touts something that doesn't really exist. Apart from the Patriot Force and Aegis ships, the rest of the BMDS is not very mobile. THAADs, TPY-2s, and a lot of the elements supporting GMD are largely in concrete or not easily transportable. And others like SBX take a long time to move across the Pacific Ocean. So it sounds like mobility on paper often turns out to be rigidity in practice. Many of those Patriots don't move around that much, and as the CNO continues to remind us, Aegis ships suffer from being tethered to the defensive islands. So language about dynamic force employment is not going to cut it. Precisely because our adversaries have broken the past monopoly on precision strike, we had better have a lot more mobility, deception, and distribution. A new roadmap towards enhanced interceptor and sensor mobility could have been pursued here. Airborne sensor assets that were lower emitting, unpredictable in their location, and more survivable were frankly endorsed in the 2010 BMDR. They haven't materialized, but today MDA is using UAV-based MTS ball packages to monitor intercept tests. That kind of a path is not present in the MDR. This leads directly to a theme that is almost absent in the document, and that is survivability. The NDS said we have to be clear-eyed about the threat. The word survivability figures large in the nuclear posture review, but is almost absent, as I said, from here. It appears 7 times in the document. One is to talk about the survivability of North Korean missiles. One is to note that the missile defense protects the rest of the joint force. One is about past improvements to Patriot radars. 2 are about testing, and 2 describe the Aegis combat system as survivable. But there's not one recommendation to making BMDS elements themselves more survivable to asymmetric attack. I think, frankly, if it was more aligned to the great power competition, it might have grappled with the realization that we no longer have air superiority and focused on tactical unpredictability, as that document recommends. The NDS further recommended that, quote, forces need to deploy, survive, operate, maneuver, and regenerate in all domains while under attack. And further recommended, quote, transitioning from large, centralized, unhardened infrastructure to smaller, dispersed, resilient, and adaptive basing. Those kinds of qualities and characteristics are what needs to be built into the BMDS to be up to the task of high-end conflict. The report's 2 references to the survivability of Aegis point instructively to a path not taken. The Aegis combat system is a layered and multi-mission air and missile defense system in a box. It's understandable why it was the foundation of EPAA. It's not the only solution, but one path might have been the deployment of Aegis ashore sites or something like it to relieve some of those tethering duties for Aegis afloat and evolve them to support air defense. But despite all that has happened over the past decade, there is not here even a tweak to the European phased adaptive approach. MDR has a follow-on study for Aegis ashore BMD protection of Hawaii. But where's the hedge for air defense of Pearl Harbor or for Guam? The document doubles down on upgrades for Aegis BMD ships, but that's more of the same. In the pursuit of multi-mission Aegis Ashore sites, Japan may soon outpace the United States. The path to survivability lies with the fundamentals again: deception, dispersal, and distribution. In other words, leveraging passive defense for active defenses to prevent suppression. That is the scale of vision and change that's going to be required here. Let me end a little bit on a positive note, and that's about space. This is what the MDR rightly flags and highlights the need for a space-based sensor layer to provide birth and death tracking. This endorsement is the single most significant recommendation of the document. It deserves hearty support. It remains to be seen, however, if the 2020 budget funds an SSL for hypersonic glide threats, for ballistic missile threats, or for both, because the sensor payload and the architecture required for those two missions is not the same. And especially if we go to a low Earth orbit only architecture, we may end up needing a second layer for BMD. So watch out, because the details here matter. I don't hold it against the MDR for not including all the details of how that's going to roll out. But that is coming on another track, but it will be critical to get that right. So let me conclude. The language of the 2019 MDR expands the vision for missile defense. It is a good start, but it does not break China. President Trump's rollout remarks said that the United States cannot simply build more of the same or make incremental improvements. But with few exceptions, the MDR's recommendations are mostly more of the same. We needed, and Congress mandated, that the Missile Defense Review be a comprehensive approach to integrated air and missile defense. It is not. The so-called new era of missile defense remains an aspiration that is yet to begin. We have a lot of fodder for conversation about how to do this, but bottom line, I think that the Trump Missile Defense Review, the reach of the Trump Missile Defense Review exceeds its grasp. Thank you very much.